agree with that when we're talking about enemies.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about the Soviet Union, we all agree that there was a difference between the commissars and the dissidents. The commissars were the guys inside who were propagating state propaganda, and the dissidents are a very small group on the fringe who are trying to call a spade, and we honor the dissidents and we condemn the commissars.
Because they were doing it in our adversaries.
Yeah, when we turn around at home, it's the opposite.
Yeah.
We honor the commissars and we condemn the dissidents. And furthermore, this goes right through back through history.
Yeah.
You know, go back to classical Greece and the Bible. So who drank the hemlock in classical Greece? Was it a commissar or a dissident? Okay. When you go to say the Bible, you read the biblical record. There are people called prophets. Just means intellectuals. I mean, they were people giving geopolitical analysis, moral lessons, that sort of thing. We call them intellectuals today. There were the people we honor as prophets. There were the people we condemn as false prophets. But if you look at the biblical record, at the time, it was the other way around. The flatterers at the court of King Ahab were the ones who were honored. The ones we call prophets were driven into the desert and imprisoned. Yeah, that's the way it's been throughout history. And understandably, power does not like to be undermined.
If you start a war, you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, there's plenty of historical evidence on that. The CIA doesn't know, Rumsfeld doesn't know, I don't know, nobody knows. You unleash a major war, all kinds of things can happen. If we look at the historical record for a guide, we know what the U.S. record has been, not only in the Middle East, but right close to home, Latin America. We've got, as I quoted the Kennedy administration declassified record, we've got a policy of 150 years. And we can look at what that's done. So we can take a look, say, at the country that has had the most, has been the beneficiary, let's say, of the most U.S. intervention in the 20th century, ever since Woodrow Wilson invaded, namely Haiti, which is the poorest country in the hemisphere. And that goes, the intervention goes right through the 90s, supporting terror. In fact, a leading terrorist is now hiding out in Queens, and the U.S. won't extradite him, Emmanuel Constant, head of the group that killed maybe 4,000 people in the early 90s, and everyone knows why they won't extradite him. He's going to spill the beans on U.S. involvement with the terrorist forces. So that's Haiti, the most intervention. The second most intervention in the 20th century has been Nicaragua, which is now the second poorest country in the hemisphere. Vying with it in second place is Guatemala, which is also vying in second place for most intervention, and we can run through the record. The highly regarded British polling agency, Oxford Research Bureau, has just updated its estimate of deaths. Their new estimate a couple of days ago is 1.3 million. That's excluding two of the most violent provinces, Karbala and Anbar. On the side, it's kind of intriguing to observe the ferocity of the debate over the actual number of deaths. There's an assumption on the part of the hawks that if we only killed a couple 100,000 people, it would be okay, so we shouldn't accept the higher estimates. You can go along with that if you like. Uncontroversially, there are over 2 million displaced within Iraq, thanks to the generosity of Jordan and Syria. The millions of refugees who have fled the wreckage of Iraq aren't totally wiped out. That includes most of the professional classes. But that welcome is fading because Jordan and Syria receive no support from the perpetrators of the crimes in Washington and London, and therefore they cannot accept that huge burden for very long. It's going to leave those 2.5 million refugees who fled in even more desperate straits. The sectarian warfare that was created by the invasion, nothing like that had ever existed before, that has devastated the country, as you know. Much of the country has been subjected to quite brutal ethnic cleansing and left in the hands of warlords and militias. That's the primary thrust of the current counterinsurgency strategy that's developed by the revered Lord Petraeus, I guess we should describe him, considering the way he's treated. He won his fame by pacifying Mosul a couple of years ago. It's now the scene of some of the most extreme violence in the country. One of the most dedicated and informed journalists who has been immersed in the ongoing tragedy, Nir Rosen, has just written an epitaph entitled "The Death of Iraq" in the very mainstream and quite important journal Current History. He writes that Iraq has been killed, never to rise again. The American occupation has been more disastrous than that of the Mongols, who sacked Baghdad in the 13th century, which has been the perception of many Iraqis as well. Only fools talk of solutions now, he went on. There is no solution. The only hope is that perhaps the damage can be contained. But Iraq is, in fact, a marginal issue. And the reasons are the traditional ones, the traditional reasoning and attitudes of the liberal doves, who all pray now, as they did 40 years ago, that the hawks will be right and that the U.S. will win a victory in this land of wreck and ruin. Iraqis, it appears, accept the highest values of Americans. That ought to be good news. Specifically, they accept the principles of the Nuremberg Tribunal that sentenced Nazi war criminals to hanging for such crimes as supporting aggression and preemptive war. It was the main charge against von Ribbentrop, for example, whose position was in the Nazi regime was that of Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. The tribunal defined aggression very straightforwardly. Aggression, in its words, is the invasion of its armed forces by one state of the territory of another state. That's simple. Obviously, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan are textbook examples of aggression. And the tribunal, as I'm sure you know, went on to characterize aggression as the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself all the accumulated evil of the whole. So everything that follows from the aggression is part of the evil of the aggression. Well, the good news from the U.S. military survey of focus groups is that Iraqis do accept the Nuremberg principles. They understand that sectarian violence and the other post-war horrors are contained within the supreme international crime committed by the invaders. I think they were not asked whether their acceptance of American values extends to the conclusion of Justice Robert Jackson, chief prosecutor for the United States at Nuremberg. He forcefully insisted that the tribunal would be mere farce if we do not apply the principles to ourselves. Well, needless to say, U.S. opinion, shared with the West generally, flatly rejects the lofty American values that were professed at Nuremberg, indeed regards them as bordering on obscene, as you could quickly discover if you try experimenting by suggesting that these values should be observed, as Iraqis insist. It's an interesting illustration of the reality, some of the reality that lies behind the famous clash of civilizations. The Beast of Baghdad was then brought in to be an even more terrifying threat, and there are also independent reasons. There is a long-standing goal. Ibrahim and others are surely correct, and it's kind of obvious. It's been a long-standing goal to restore to U.S. control the second largest oil reserves in the world. It's been recognized ever since the mid-40s, quote the State Department in 1945, that this is a major component of what they called a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. And a major theme of U.S. foreign policy since the Second World War has been to make sure that the U.S. Dominates it. France was expelled on the interesting grounds that it was an enemy state since it had been occupied by Germany, so therefore its contracts were void. And England was slowly reduced to what the Foreign Office calls, British Foreign Office calls a junior partner. The U.S. puts it differently. 40 years ago, a senior statesman, probably Dean Acheson, in internal discussion described Britain as our lieutenant. The fashionable word is partner, and they like to hear the fashionable word, but the reality is the actual word. And control over Middle East oil has been a very large part of it from the Second World War. Let me stress that it's control, it's not access. There's a lot of confusion about that. The United States really doesn't care much about access to Middle East oil. From up until 1970, didn't care at all. North America was the biggest producer, but it didn't affect the need to control the region. Since then, the biggest importer has usually been Venezuela. If you look at U.S. intelligence projections, for example, the National Intelligence Council projections for the next 15 years, they predict and suggest that the U.S. should rely on a more secure Atlantic Basin resources, West Africa and Latin America. But that has absolutely nothing to do with control over Middle East oil. Now, that has to do with its being one of the greatest material prizes in world history, which means that whoever controls it and can have an effect on setting price and production levels can also determine that the wealth, vast amount of the wealth, flows right back here, and it does. It's independent of access to oil. A stupendous source of strategic power has nothing to do with access. That translates as a lever of world control. And that's been recognized clearly since the 1940s, and it remains true today. Well, September 11th gave a pretext. The domestic politics affects the timing, and the strategy has been working quite brilliantly. You see it right now in the midterm elections. It's going to be even more important next year, presumably. If you put yourselves in, say, Karl Rove's shoes, Bush's campaign manager, when the presidential campaign begins in a little over a year, do you really want people to be thinking about what's happening to their pension or how they're going to take care of their elderly mother or what about their job, or why can't they get health care? What about an environment that their children might live in? Things like that are certainly not what they want people to be paying attention to. They'll want people to be, singing praises to the brave cowboy who saved them from destruction at the hands of a colossal foe, sort of Martian foe, and will by then be marching on to some new adventure. Exactly as Gibbon says, that's the tradition, that's the classic strategy of an endangered right-wing oligarchy, which wants to divert mass content, which has plenty of ground, into nationalism and fear. And it takes a lot of work to overlook the fact that the only people who are afraid of Condoleezza Rice's mushroom cloud, which is going to consume us imminently, the only people who are afraid of it are Americans, not the people of the region, for example. I mean, they're afraid, but they're afraid of the United States more than they are of Iraq. Of course, Iraqis are afraid of Saddam Hussein, and they have every right to be, but that can't possibly be the reason for the U.S. war. I mean, the U.S. was supporting Saddam right through his worst atrocities, helping him develop weapons of mass destruction right up to the day of the invasion of Kuwait. And it's the same people who are running Washington right now. So whatever the reasons are, it's not that. They're afraid of Saddam Hussein, but they also know that he can't do very much. In fact, very little. If he made a move anywhere, Iraq would be obliterated.
If you believed that Saddam Hussein had biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons and was imminently going to use them, perhaps not on us, but on his neighbors, and with the potential of killing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, would there be any circumstances that you would agree that it would be worthwhile for the U.S. to use military force against him?
Nobody in the region is worried about it. Isn't that a little surprising? I mean, Kuwait and Iran, for example, both of them invaded by Saddam when he was our ally. They're not calling for the use of military force. In fact, they're opposing it. The only country in the region that's calling for military force is Israel, and they have their own reasons. The only people who seem to be afraid of this possibility, in fact, even Israeli military intelligence, the head of Israeli military intelligence recently announced that he doesn't, and they watch it pretty closely, that they don't see any nuclear threat from Iraq, maybe 4 or 5 years from now, but not in the near future. I'm strongly opposed to allowing Iraq to develop nuclear weapons. That's why when George Bush and number one and his cohorts were providing assistance to Saddam in developing nuclear weapons, I was writing against it and opposing it. Give you the citations if you want. That's 1990, 1998, 1989, 1988. Yeah, I was strongly opposing the U.S. and British efforts at the time to provide Saddam with the means of developing weapons of mass destruction. I think it was horrifying. And I certainly wouldn't want it to happen now. And if we're interested in stopping it, yeah, everybody knows the way. You get inspectors back. It's certainly for nuclear weapons that's going to work, maybe not for everything else. But just think for a second. Suppose I had nuclear weapons in my backyard, for instance. Would it be a threat to anyone? Or would it be a deterrent? Well, only under one condition, that I let people know I had them. Okay? If they're hidden in my garage, they're neither a threat nor a deterrent, right? Everybody knows this. If Saddam Hussein, in the extremely unlikely contingency that he'll develop nuclear weapons, if they were to be usable for anything, he'd have to let people know he had them. Well, the minute there's a hint that he has them, Iraq gets obliterated. Okay? Suppose there was any move made towards using them, well, they get obliterated squared. That's why the people in the region, apart from not believing it, aren't afraid of it, and why they're afraid of the United States. There are reasons for, there are plenty of things to be worried about. So, for example, loose nukes getting into the hands of terrorists, that's a problem. And it's not a new one. That predates September 11th. As I mentioned, you can read technical papers in the literature, for example, in the journal International Security, 4 or 5 years ago, pointing out that, I'm sort of close to quoting now, that this is way before 9/11, that actually citing government studies, which show that, which conclude that a well-planned effort to smuggle weapons of mass destruction, meaning nuclear weapons, into the United States would have a 90% probability of success, far higher than any missile attack with or without national missile defense.
We're all aware that right at this moment, bodies are being torn to shreds by infernal weapons. Unknown numbers of people who have already been driven to the edge of survival by a decade of murderous sanctions may be facing starvation and slow death. Under these circumstances, it's not very easy to step back and try to ask why all this is happening, where it's likely to go, and what we can do to shape the future. Well, not everyone is dismayed. So take Osama bin Laden. If he's alive somewhere, I'm sure he's enjoying mightily the scenes that are portrayed in one way on television here and in a different way by correspondents and commentators who are not embedded within the invading system. He's made it very clear what he wants. He wants a war to the death between the evil empire and the billions of people around the world, and that's what he's getting. The political, even before the invasion of Iraq, the U.S. political leadership had inspired
extraordinary level of fear throughout the world, not just the Arab and the Muslim world. Since the invasion, the war that the world has seen, not the one being portrayed here, that war has aroused a wave of revulsion that's actually becoming a serious concern even to policymakers here, and it's reaching the mainstream press. So just in the last few days, the mainstream press has been publishing lead articles about it. They report, give you some quotes, a growing hatred of America, regarded as a violent aggressor, a cruel aggressor that's relying on overwhelming force to crush anyone who's in its way, and worse still, it seems to be rejoicing in its ability to destroy a defenseless enemy, people shooting with rusting rifles at tanks and bombers. The rejoicing over that is not inspiring great love around the world. In September, Condoleezza Rice showed up with her prediction that the next thing we're going to hear about Saddam Hussein is a mushroom cloud. They're planning to destroy us. And then there came a series of outlandish lies repeated passionately by Bush and others, distributed quite uncritically by the media, and it had an immediate effect. You take a look at polls by September, after this campaign began, roughly 60% of the population believed it and continue to believe it. 60% of the population, plus or minus, believes that Saddam Hussein was an imminent threat. They got to keep repeating it to keep that level up. About half the population, about a month ago, it's probably higher now, believe that Iraq was responsible for the September 11th attack, that Iraqis were on the plains. Those beliefs turn out to be highly correlated with support for the war, and it's understandable. If you think that Saddam Hussein's an imminent threat, already destroyed the World Trade Center, planning something new, maybe a nuclear bomb, then it's understandable that you'd want to do something to get rid of him. That's a remarkable achievement of government media propaganda. You have to bear in mind that this is unique to the United States. Nowhere else where anyone believes anything like this, nor is it believed here by anybody who knows anything, like CIA or foreign policy analysts. But it has been imposed on the population. And that's impressive. It's not the first time, but it's impressive. As far as it was aimed at the election, and for the election it just barely worked. They barely managed to maintain control. Tens of thousands of votes, not much. And something similar is going to be needed for the next election. That's what Rove says this morning. It says for the next election we've got to create an image of George Bush as a powerful leader, a savior, who by then will be marching off to slay some new dragons. So the U.S. didn't need the oil. In fact, it barely needs it today. Look at intelligence projections. They're expecting to rely on more secure Atlantic Basin resources, Western Africa, Western Hemisphere. But they want to control it, just as they did after the Second World War. And there's a reason for that. If you control a stupendous source of strategic power, you control the world. That's a lever of world control. You have what planners at the time called veto power over other countries. You can also set prices and production levels within the range that you want, and you can make sure that the profits flow back into the right pockets. It is an enormous to gain control over this resource and to have probably military bases there is a tremendous achievement for world control, if that's what you're aiming at. You read counter-arguments to this, and they're worth looking at. So it's argued that can't be true because the costs of reconstruction are going to be greater than the profits that will be made. Well, maybe that's true, maybe it isn't, but it's totally irrelevant. And the reason is because the costs of reconstruction are going to be paid by the taxpayer, by you. and the profits are going to go right into the pockets of the energy corporations. So yeah, doesn't matter how they balance out, it's just another taxpayer subsidy to the rich. Doesn't matter what the numbers are. So all the discussions are completely irrelevant. The profits will go to, Bechtel Corporation or Dick Cheney's Halliburton Empire or one thing or another, which will be chosen to what will be called rebuild Iraq at taxpayer expense. That's part of the way in which you transfer wealth and power from the population to the rich. Many ways, and that's one. Is there another way to proceed at this point? Yeah, there sure is. The United States could pay reparations to Iraq. That would be proper. And remember what it is. I mean, you're not reading about it in the newspapers, but you all know it's reparations from 20 years of devastation of Iraq. First 10 years of support for Saddam Hussein, right through his worst atrocities. The guy's now in office. They didn't care about the atrocities. Continued to support him, provide him with means to develop weapons of mass destruction. They even said why they were doing it. It didn't have to do with the war with Iran. It continued after Iran. The reason was because of, as George Bush #1 explained, his administration, our duty to support American exporters. That's why we had to support Saddam Hussein after the gassing of the Kurds and everything else. And then they added the usual boilerplate about Saddam Hussein being a source of stability and, we can help improve the human rights situation and so on. That went right up to the day of the invasion of Kuwait. First mistake. It didn't follow orders. The other crimes were fine. Then comes the war and a decade of sanctions, which have devastated the population, civilian population, and strengthened Saddam Hussein, and furthermore made the population more dependent on him. I mean, he's a murderous tyrant, but a very efficient one. He had a very efficient food distribution system which people were dependent on to stay alive. The World Food Organization says it's the most efficient food distribution system they know of. They say they can't duplicate it even by half. Monster, but an efficient monster, not the first one in history. So it forced the population to be dependent on him. It devastated the civilian society, strengthened Saddam Hussein. That's one reason why he's still there. Otherwise, he'd probably have been overthrown by now. Remember that Saddam Hussein was not the only monster who was supported by the guys now in Washington. They had quite an entourage that they collected. They were supporting, among others, Marcos and Duvalier and Suharto and Mobutu, who was the first foreign leader invited to the Bush White House. They loved them so much. Ceausescu is easily comparable to Saddam Hussein, vicious, murderous tyrant, supported up until the day he was overthrown by the people now in office. Every single one of those guys was overthrown from within. Why didn't it happen to Saddam, even though they were being supported by the United States? Why didn't it happen to Saddam Hussein? Well, the Westerners who know Iraq best have been talking about this for years. You don't read about them in the American media. You can't find the names in the New York Times index. You can read them in Canada or overseas, England or elsewhere. Namely, the administrators of the UN so-called oil for food programs, Dennis Halliday and Hans von Sponeck. Both of them resigned in protest against what they called the genocidal effect of the program, the sanctions, and the fact that they were destroying the civilian society and strengthening Saddam Hussein. And they've been pointing out for years that the way to overthrow Saddam Hussein is from within, just like every other gangster that was supported by the people now in Washington. Can't happen if you destroy the civilian society and you strengthen the dictator and you make people dependent on him. The main effect of the sanctions hasn't harmed Saddam Hussein and strengthened him, but it's kept him from being overthrown. Otherwise, chances are he would have gone the way of Ceausescu and the rest of them a long time ago. But an internal revolt is unacceptable to the United States, just as Saddam's leaving Iraq is unacceptable, as they announced at the summit meeting. The reason is very simple. It doesn't leave the United States in charge. It leaves the Iraqi people in charge, and that's no good. At the Azores summit, Bush and Blair announced it explicitly. They said, even if Saddam Hussein goes, we're going to invade anyway, because we have to impose the regime of our choice. A year ago, last March, the Democratic-controlled Congress did produce a withdrawal proposal, and it was analyzed by General Kevin Ryan, who was at the time a senior fellow at the Harvard University Kennedy School Belfer Center on International Affairs. And he pointed out that the Democratic proposal had a number of qualifications. One was that the president was able to waive any restrictions in the case of national security. Well, that opens the door to anything. That's permanent exception to any kind of withdrawal. Secondly, U.S. forces, though they were to be withdrawn sooner or later, would remain for special missions. The special missions were three. One, combating terrorism, which again is open-ended. Two, training Iraqi forces, again open-ended. And third, protecting U.S. facilities, citizens, and forces. Well, what are U.S. facilities? Well, first of all, they include the huge military bases that are being built around the country, not with the intention of being dismantled, of course. One of them, the Balad base right north of Baghdad, is described by observers there as probably the busiest aircraft facility in the world. And that's one that'll have to be protected, and there are several others around the country. We really don't know how many because it's kept more or less quiet. They're not called permanent bases. The preferred Orwellism these days is enduring bases, so they'll endure as long as the U.S. wants them to. At the end of time, they may disappear. So they'll protect and the other facility that has to be protected is an object which is called the embassy. This is nothing like any embassy in the world or in history. It's a city, a self-contained city inside the green zone, which is going to be protected by Americans, and with everything from McDonald's to missile defense systems. Well, more good news is the decline in sectarian violence. That's attributable in part to the murderous ethnic cleansing that Iraqis blame on the invasion. The result of it is there are simply fewer people to kill, so sectarian violence declines. It's also attributable to the new counterinsurgency doctrine, Washington's decision to support the tribal groups that had already organized to drive out Iraqi al-Qaeda, to an increase in U.S. troops, and to the decision of the Sadr's Mahdi army to consolidate its gains, to stop direct fighting and work politically. That's what the press calls halting aggression by the Mahdi army. Notice that only Iraqis can commit aggression in Iraq, or Iranians, of course, but no one else. Well, it's possible that Petraeus' strategy may approach the success of the Russians in Chechnya, where, I'll quote the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, Chechnya, the fighting is now limited and sporadic, and Grozny is in the midst of a building boom after having been reduced to rubble by the Russian attack. Well, maybe someday Baghdad and Fallujah also will enjoy, continue the quote, electricity restored in many neighborhoods, new businesses opening, and the city's main streets repaved, as in booming Grozny. Possible, but dubious, in the light of the likely consequence of creating warlord armies that may be the seeds of even greater sectarian violence, adding to the accumulated evil of the aggression. Well, if Russians share the beliefs and attitudes of elite liberal intellectuals in the West, then they must be praising Putin's wisdom and statesmanship for his achievements in Chechnya. Formerly, they turned into a land of wreck and ruin and are now rebuilding. Great achievement. Washington does have expectations, and they're explicit. They're outlined in a Declaration of Principles that was agreed upon, if you can call it that, between the United States and the U.S.-backed, U.S.-installed Iraqi government under military occupation. The two of them issued the Declaration of Principles. It allows U.S. forces to remain indefinitely in Iraq in order to deter foreign aggression. Well, the only aggression in sight is from the United States, but that's not aggression by definition. And also to facilitate and encourage the flow of foreign investments in Iraq, especially American investments. I'm quoting. That's an unusually brazen expression of imperial will. Actually, it was heightened a few days ago when George Bush issued another one of his signing statements declaring that he will reject crucial provisions of congressional legislation that he had just signed, including the provision that forbids spending taxpayer money, I'm quoting, to establish any military installation or base for the purpose of providing for the permanent stationing of U.S. armed forces in Iraq, or to exercise U.S. control of the oil resources of Iraq. Okay? Shortly after, the New York Times reported that Washington insists, if you own the world, you insists that the Baghdad government give the United States broad authority to conduct combat operations, a demand that faces a potential buzzsaw of opposition from Iraq with its deep sensitivities about being seen as a dependent state. It's supposed to be more third world irrationality. So in brief, the United States is now insisting that Iraq must agree to allow permanent U.S. military installations, grant the United States the right to conduct combat operations freely, and to guarantee U.S. control over the oil resources of Iraq. Okay, it's all very explicit on the table. It's kind of interesting that these reports do not elicit any reflection on the reasons why the United States invaded Iraq. You've heard those reasons offered, but they were dismissed with ridicule. Now they're openly conceded to be accurate, but not eliciting any retraction or even any reflection. There was an election in Iraq, and personally I think, I applaud it. I applaud Iraqis who went to the polls. They should have. What was the U.S. attitude toward the elections? The U.S. tried in every imaginable way to prevent the elections. It went right through almost to the end. In fact, I have a book that came out last summer in which I was just quoting the press, New York Times, which was reporting accurately U.S. efforts to undermine any potential election, because they were concerned that if there was an election, any kind of elected government might call on the U.S. forces to leave. And the U.S. obviously can't accept that, so they had to do everything possible to stop an election, caucus system, write a constitution, anything you can dream up. Well, they weren't able to succeed, which is quite remarkable. And if we had anything remotely resembling a free press, there would be headlines lauding the Iraqi people for a tremendous victory of nonviolent resistance. The U.S. doesn't care about the suicide bombers. I mean, the arena of violence, the U.S. has such overwhelming force, it's going to win. In fact, suicide bombers are kind of a help. What they can't deal with, and no imperial power can deal with, is nonviolent mass popular resistance. That's hard to deal with. And the Sistani was kind of the symbol for it, but he was able. They brought out big demonstrations and just refusal to accept the illegal Bremer laws, which were opening up Iraq to the Western takeover. Action after action made it clear to Bush's handlers that they're going to have to permit an election. Well, by the time they realized that, they of course took credit for the election. All right, that's normal. And the press and intellectuals immediately switched into that mode, praising the United States for bringing about the election that they had tried in every possible way to prevent. And that then comes, what do you do about it? Well, you have to somehow subvert it. And if you read the business press, they tell the truth. Like the Wall Street Journal had an article right around the time of the election saying, it's kind of tricky, they're going to have this election. So we have to, and in fact, every political party, even the U.S. candidate, Alawi, even his party, had to have a plank in it calling for withdrawal, because that's what people were voting for. But the journal pointed out that the U.S. will work in some fashion to ensure that the Iraqis are satisfied with what he called vague promises for withdrawal. So, okay, yeah, maybe they're voting for withdrawal, but we'll manipulate the political class and, plenty of power. I mean, after all, you've got an occupying army, you've got all the, after having destroyed the country, you have all the economic force that's capable of somehow rebuilding a society. So this, and political classes are totally corrupt anyway most of the time, and not hard to buy off everywhere here too. So yes, it's a good chance that they can somehow coerce the political leadership into accepting vague promises for withdrawal. And to make sure that there wouldn't be any problems in the election, the U.S. forced out the one element of the free press, namely Al Jazeera, which is the one independent press. Got to make sure that they're not there. Just like they had to bomb them out of Kabul and bomb them out of Baghdad and so on, because you can't allow a free press around because it might report the wrong thing, especially since people are looking at it. So they were kicked out. The U.S. candidate was given every possible advantage, total access to state television, all the resources, but he got creamed. In fact, isn't even technically in the cabinet. So now they've got this situation. They have succeeded in exactly how, I don't know, maybe you can tell me, but one way or another, the formal political leadership has backed off of the election promises to say what the Wall Street Journal wanted, vague promises of ultimate withdrawal, despite what the population voted for. Whether nonviolent resistance will permit this or not, we'll see. But it's pretty clear what the U.S. wants. It's almost inconceivable that the U.S. could permit a sovereign democratic Iraq. I mean, it's about as close to inconceivable as anything you can imagine. And again, the reasons are transparent. I mean, simply ask yourself what the policies of a sovereign democratic Iraq would be. Okay? First of all, it'll be, if it's at all minimally democratic, there'll be a Shiite majority. So they'll have a significant voice in what happens. Well, they're not madly in love with Iran by any means, but they'd rather have a friendly neighbor than a hostile neighbor. So they'll mend fences with Iran, as was already happening before the invasion. So you'll have some sort of, coexistence, at least, maybe more, between Shiite Iran and Shiite Iraq. Furthermore, there's a Shiite population in the northern part of Saudi Arabia, which happens to be where all the oil is. But the U.S. has established a network of bases all everywhere. I mean, after the bombing of Serbia, with, again, totally fraudulent claims. I mean, by now they're conceded to be fraudulent. The U.S. did end up with one of its biggest military bases in the world, in Kosovo, Camp Bondsteel, which happens to be right on an oil transition route. And there's bases in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan, another one of those great democratic countries, and everywhere else. I mean, they had to move them out of Saudi Arabia thanks to Osama bin Laden. That's one point that Paul Wolfowitz made, which is correct. They said we can't keep the bases in Saudi Arabia because it's just going to stir up too much terror and violence and so on, so we got to move them somewhere else, the Gulf Emirates, Iraq, someplace. But the network of bases surrounding the region is extraordinary. I mean, it always has been, but it's being built up even further. Remember that the bases include Turkey, crucially, that's always been the prime U.S. ally in the region, and Israel, which is now an offshore U.S. military base virtually. I mean, it's not advertised much, but
Israel, which is a small country on its own, can't do anything, but as a U.S. client, has air and armored forces which are larger and technologically more advanced than any NATO power, apart from the U.S. Furthermore, in the last year, the Bush administration has sent over 100 its most advanced jet bombers to Israel, very openly announced. They don't want to keep it secret. Openly announced as being capable of bombing Iran. And as they point out, the updated versions are the ones that Israel used to bomb Iraq, the Osirak reactor. It's not mentioned here that the bombing of the Osirak reactor didn't end Saddam's nuclear weapons program. It initiated it. The reactor that was bombed was inspected immediately afterwards by the head of Harvard's physics department, who's a specialist on nuclear reactors, who wrote an article about it in Nature, the world's leading science journal, in which he pointed out that this reactor can't possibly be used for nuclear weapons, had a different design, and so on. We know from Iraqi defectors who were working there that right after that they got an order to start working on nuclear weapons. Yeah, naturally, it's a deterrent. So the bombing initiated the nuclear weapons program, which the U.S. and Britain then accelerated. And these announcements, this is a large part of the Israeli Air Force, nobody knows how much, is based in eastern Turkey, in the U.S. bases there, carrying out reconnaissance, at least over at the Iranian border. And this is, Turkey and Israel alone is a huge military force, and the rest of the bases are for the world superpower, completely surrounding the region.
Frankly, I'm surprised. Contrary to what was said before, I thought that the invasion of Iraq would be a quick success. I thought it would be one of the easiest military victories in history. Iraq was totally defenseless. It barely existed. The invasion eliminated two destructive regimes, not one. They eliminated Saddam Hussein. They also terminated the sanctions, which had devastated the society, killed hundreds of thousands of people. The U.S. could come in, get a class from the MIT Electrical Engineering Department, probably get the electricity started again. Instead of being one of the easiest military victories in history, it became one of the worst military catastrophes in history.
Did you think that an insurgency was inevitable there?
Not if they had done it with any sense. I wouldn't have liked a U.S. I'm not in favor of a U.S. military victory. I was against the invasion. But my guess was it would easily be successful. But the incompetence and arrogance of the Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz crowd is just kind of indescribable. They created a catastrophe even for themselves.
Tom Rick spends about 600 pages describing it.
Yeah, okay, and well, you know more about it than I do, but it's obvious even from my point of view. And what they have done, as you say, is empower a Shiite majority, which I'm sure was the last thing they wanted. After all, they tried in every way they could to prevent an actual election. They were finally forced to allow it mainly by Ayatollah Sistani. Well, that's
Noam Chomsky.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the United States that created Sadr as a major figure, but the major Shiite groups like Skiri and the Badr Brigade, I mean, their background is Iranian.
Yes,
the Badr Brigade was trained in Iran.
Yeah. People forget actually that Sistani is, I think, still an Iranian citizen.
Sistani, yeah, he was born in Iran. In fact, a lot of the clerics have close connections with Iran. I mean, anybody who had minimal knowledge of the region knew that if Iraq is granted any degree of sovereignty and minimal democracy, the Shiite, just what you read, the Shiite majority will try to strengthen its relations with Iran. And it's worse than that. Surely people in military intelligence must know this. And by an accident of geography, the major energy resources of the world happen to be in Shiite areas, southern Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia.
Well, you're putting your finger on an
Saudi
interesting aspect of the war planning here, which was that people who had knowledge were not invited back to meetings because they expressed skepticism and doubt about the assurance that this would be easy.
Yeah, my suspicion is if we ever get declassified documents on this 30 years from now, we'll find that the military was opposed, that intelligence was opposed, and that they were overruled by a clique of extremist fanatics.
Well, actually, one thing I report in my book, it hadn't been disclosed before, was that in the fall of 2002, an order went out from the Joint Staff saying that if we invade Iraq, you will consider it part of the war on terror. The reason they had to do that is because so many officers had expressed concern, saying, what the hell does Iraq have to do with the war on terror? Yeah. Why are you talking about Iraq? Why aren't we keeping an eye on bin Laden?
Right. And in fact, enough information has leaked from CIA and other intelligence agencies to indicate that was probably their interpretation too. And it takes no great genius. I mean, it's obvious. And let me continue on the Saudi Arabian thing, which is probably their major nightmare. Right across the border, it happens to be the region of Saudi Arabia where most of the oil is, has a Shiite majority. They've been bitterly repressed by the U.S.-backed tyranny. They're now pressing, you can read this in the press, pressing for more rights, more autonomy. I mean, you can imagine a loosely linked Shiite alliance, Iran, southern Iraq, Saudi Arabia, controlling most of the world's oil and independent of Washington. I mean, it's like the ultimate nightmare for planners, almost.
Yeah, I could easily see an Iraqi government dominated by Shiites saying we want to extend the hand of sympathy to our oppressed brothers in Arabia.
And Saudi Arabia, which is where the oil is, and to Iran. And in fact, it could get worse. They're already making moves towards the east. The United States can intimidate Europe. They shake their fist and say, disinvest from Iran, and the big corporations pull out. They can't intimidate China. That's why they're so afraid of China.
And China wants energy sources.
China moves in. In fact, very, very dramatically. When President Hu visited Washington a couple of months ago, the Bush administration felt they could insult him, so they didn't grant him a state dinner, only a state lunch. He was perfectly happy with that. He went back and insulted them in spades. He flew off to Saudi Arabia immediately, made new deals for trade and investment with King Abdullah, who's returning his visit. They're sending them weapons. They're happy to do it. And the Saudi Arabians and the Iranians are perfectly happy with that. The Bush administration planners have succeeded in threatening what was one of the core principles of U.S. foreign policy since World War II, namely controlling the world's energy resources.
But also, they decided after 9/11 that stability was no longer our goal in the Middle East. That had been the goal literally for half a century. We want stability really at all costs in the Middle East.
This is Wolfowitz doctrine.
Wolfowitz, and yes, especially Wolfowitz, but others around him would say, I remember being told in interviews, they'd say containment was the part of the problem. Containing Iraq was part of the problem, and if you like 9/11, keep up a policy of containment. And so stability became not the goal, but the target of U.S. policy in the Middle East. And they were going to, quote-unquote, drain the swamp. So in some ways, you still see them arguing that line, that what you're seeing now is the birth pangs of a new Middle East. What do you make of that, Professor Chomsky, this idea that the U.S. goal in the Middle East is now instability rather than stability?
Yeah, I don't really believe it. I think they want Wolfowitz I'll put to the side. There's a reason why he was kicked out of Washington. He was just an embarrassment. But Rumsfeld and Cheney are there, Rice is there, and they're rational people. I think they wanted the kind of stability that the U.S. has, say, and tries to have in Latin America and elsewhere, namely subordinate regimes. They're not trying to overthrow the government of Saudi Arabia. That's the oldest and most valued ally of the United States. It's part of U.S. support for radical Islamic fundamentalism.
Well, let me pursue that with you. Why then the trashing of sort of the old-line Republican mandarins like Ben Scowcroft and James Baker?
Because they were sane. They were thinking through what's going to happen. And these guys are, well, you know them better than I do, they're an extremist group who wants to hold tight authority, run everything in a very authoritarian fashion, and they think they can do what they want. I mean, look at the way they planned the war in Iraq. I mean, anyone with brains could have told them that's going to be a disaster.
Tom Ricks, I remember years ago, Tom Winship, then the editor of the Boston Globe, the late Tom Winship used to say, we got to get Chomsky on staff here. Just walk him through the newsroom every once in a while and say, what the hell is going on? Question, why doesn't the Pentagon call Noam Chomsky once in a while and say, does this make any sense?
Well, actually, they did. I gave a talk in West Point.
If they did, I'd write a story about it. I'd be fascinated.
Actually, Tom, you may not know this, but Tom offered me a job at the Globe, suggested that I leave MIT and go to the Globe to pick out stories that they're not covering. I figured that would last for about a week. So,
but come on, the Pentagon needs some help. This is a question of judgment and values, but also of, have we crossed any T's, dotted any I's? Do we know what in the world we're doing?
Well,
the military now, I think, is more open to information than it was, partly because going into this war, they have been told, we don't want all these experts bothering us, either military professional experts or area experts who understood Arabic language and history and culture. So when General Shinseki got up and gave his best professional military advice, he was slapped down hard and publicly. Likewise, when area experts said, you really need to think about, these sectarian differences, these demographic issues, locations of energy, they were not invited back. I knew a military intelligence expert who reviewed part of the Annex Bravo, which is the intelligence appendix to a war plan, sent in a list of issues that he had with it, and literally was not invited back to the next meeting because people who raised issues made the occupation seem difficult, and they wanted to tell you that the occupation was going to be easy.
Well, I'm interested in your opinion about this, but my impression from outside is that the military themselves did not want the war, but that the Pentagon civilians did. Rumsfeld, Cheney, that bunch.
Yeah, during 2002, there was enormous amounts of skepticism about invading Iraq. Why exactly? What new information do you have? And it really took, in the fall of 2002, a couple of events. When Vice President Cheney got up and said on August 26, 2002, that, quote, there is no doubt about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, the military got the message. The debate's over, and in our society, and I think properly, when the civilians give the orders, the military shuts up, salutes smartly, and moves out. Yeah. A month later, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld said the debate is over. They got the message. And finally, you had the formal issuance of an order from the Joint Staff saying you will consider this part of the war on terror. Mm-hmm. So the military had expressed their doubts and skepticism. They were unhappy about it. But then they were told, you need to go do this. And
when did General Zinni bail out? General
Zinni had retired and, in fact, endorsed Bush and Cheney in the 2000 campaign.
2000, my recollection is that he criticized this operation even before it started.
Oh yeah, September 2002 and October 2002, he became quite publicly critical, partly because when he asked a senior officer at Central Command, what about my Desert Crossing war plan, which is a plan for what do we do if the government in Iraq collapses, they said, what? We'd never heard of that. This is something he'd worked on for years.
Mm. And the State Department, of course, had extensive plans, which they apparently just junked.
Yeah, the future of Iraq studies. There was also work by the Army War College looking at what the issues would be. And instead, I get the impression that Rumsfeld kind of cooked up what he thought might be the problems, wrote a list of like 13 issues that really were in disregard of professional knowledge of counterinsurgency. There are certain things that, again and again, have worked in counterinsurgency campaigns. Close the borders, treat your prisoners well. And the war plan was written in disregard of that, as was the occupation plan.